From Focal Point Radio and Radio Fairfax in Fairfax, Virginia, this is the Mimi Geerges Show. Several things happened in 2011 to strain relations between the U.S. and Pakistan. The most dramatic, of course, being the killing of Osama bin Laden by U.S. Navy SEALs. He'd been hiding in a secure compound a few blocks away from Pakistan's equivalent of West Point. It was a stunning display of either incompetence or betrayal. But beyond that situation, Pakistan is complicated. Founded over 60 years ago as an Islamic democracy, Pakistan is rife with contradictions. Opulent cities versus primitive villages, moderate versus radical Islam, military versus political rule, we hate America versus we don't hate them that much. And did I mention that they have nuclear weapons? Washington Post correspondent Pamela Constable has been reporting from Pakistan since 1998. She's written about the internal struggles of Pakistani society and how she says it's essentially at war with itself. The book is called Playing with Fire. Pamela Constable joins me in the studio. Pamela, welcome to the program.
Delighted to be here, Mimi.
A lot has already been said about bin Laden hiding in plain view in Pakistan for about 5 years. What do you think? Did they know about it?
If you mean they, the Pakistani government and the senior authorities of Pakistan, I find it very hard to believe that they knew. I mean, it's still possible that it will come out that they did, and it's highly likely that some people in Pakistan knew. But I find it hard to believe that the senior officials, military intelligence officials, knew because he was such a hot potato. You know, the discovery of him and what then turned out to be the killing of him was so humiliating for Pakistan and just was such a blow to their notions of national sovereignty and pride in their own abilities. Remember, the United States and Pakistan ostensibly have been strategic partners in the war against terrorism now for nearly a decade, and Osama bin Laden was the number one fugitive of that war, and Pakistan's government had worked very hard with the United States to track down, arrest, and kill other members of al-Qaeda. So for them to be so cynical and so conspiratorial that they would actually hide its leader, I still find it hard to believe.
So this is incompetence, essentially.
That would be the other alternative.
You say that the most important thing you've learned is that many Pakistanis feel they have no power. Why is that?
That's a very good question. Pakistan, as you know, it's a Muslim democracy. It has elected leaders. It has an elected president and prime minister. It has a functioning parliament. It has an independent or at least separate judiciary. It has a free and very outspoken press. It has many trappings of democracy. But what I found in reporting there over the years as a journalist and then in researching the book, during which I traveled widely in the country just talking to ordinary people, was that in many, many ways the actual lives of most Pakistanis are they feel really that they don't have any place to address their grievances. They don't feel free to rise above their station in life. They feel trapped by powerful forces, whether that means, the police or the landowners or tribal leaders or the military, that most Pakistanis, and remember this is a country in which most people are very poor, it's a country of maybe 175, 180 million people, of which the great majority are still rural peasants or laborers working in cities. So they don't really feel that they have any place to turn.
We mentioned the word democracy. Do you just feel that it's a democracy in name only, that they're really not?
Pakistan, since it was founded more than 63 years ago, has gone through various periods of different kinds of rule. It has gone through periods of total dictatorship. It's gone through periods of martial law administration. It's gone through periods of democracy with elected leaders. But even though some of those leaders started out to be genuine and to be promising, almost all of them ended up either leaving office before their term because they were thrown out by the military, in some cases killed, in other cases pressured to leave office. And the military has intervened a number of times to what it would always say would be to stop the corrupt and incompetent practices of the civilian leaders. So it's never really had a chance to mature into what you'd call a modern institutionalized democracy.
Is Pakistan on its way to becoming a failed state?
Not necessarily. I mean, Pakistan has been written off as a failed state, years ago by others, but I've never quite accepted that definition, because if you spend time there and you cover news that's happening there for a long time, you encounter very quickly both the size and the power of the state. It has a huge administrative bureaucracy, which was set up by the British under colonial rule. It has one of the largest, most professional armies in the world. It has a large industrial base. It has, superhighways. It has, a major financial capital like New York and Karachi with skyscrapers. The problem is that mostly because of failures of political and military leadership, that state has failed to provide the services and the development that people need.
Pamela Constable is in the studio with me. She's a foreign correspondent and former deputy foreign editor at The Washington Post. She's reported extensively from Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, and Iraq. The book is Playing with Fire: Pakistan at War with Itself. You say that the second most important thing you learned is that truth is, quote, an elusive and malleable commodity. What does that mean?
It means that and you first encounter this, or I first encountered it, in some of the major crimes that occurred. And since we're talking about politics, I'll mention first the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, who was a two-time prime minister, a very charismatic leader, probably the most charismatic leader in Pakistan or from Pakistan in the contemporary time period. And she had returned from many years in exile, and she was running for office again, and she stood a very, very good chance of winning. She was assassinated at a public rally, December 27th, 2007. And that crime was never solved. It happened in a public place with heavy security. Multiple investigations were launched, even by the United Nations and Scotland Yard, as well as by many different Pakistani agencies. It was simply never solved. And so what you got instead was what passes often for truth in Pakistan, which is a million theories and rumors and conspiracies and blame being pointed conveniently at everyone's enemies.
But why? They know who did it. I mean, are they afraid to arrest somebody?
Well, I would not say that they know who did it, and I'm not even sure who they are.
They don't want to know?
But
the police. Let's just say the police.
Well, the police certainly don't know. I mean, the police, if you read the UN report, which was quite devastating, were not allowed to do their job. There was intervention at higher levels from the intelligence agencies. The crime scene, the place that she was assassinated in a public parking area, instead of being cordoned off, was immediately hosed down so that evidence could not be gathered, or certainly would not be gathered. There were many, many things that happened that were extremely odd. Because probably there were forces within the society that found it not convenient for the truth to be known. And when the UN did its investigation, after all the Pakistani investigations had failed to come up with anything, what the authors of it said were that they were shocked at how clear it was that the intelligence agencies had worked against the normal police functions of trying to find out what had actually happened that day.
So for me, for an outsider, if the intelligence is trying to work against the police, that tells me that intelligence was involved in the assassination and they're trying to cover it up.
Well, it may be true, but it also may be true, and probably more likely true, that when you have a part of government that is sort of its own entity, that it has its own political agenda, this is an agency that has not only been working to fight Pakistan's enemies, but has been working to manipulate its internal politics for a very long time.
This is the ISI.
Right. It may simply have thought that they could take advantage of the moment and spin it a certain way. It doesn't necessarily mean that they killed her, although they certainly didn't like her, but it does mean that this was another case in which everyone sought to play the angles, to find ways to spin it in ways that could be useful, rather than putting the primary goal of finding out the truth.
Pakistanis are very passionate about their religion, Islam. Where does that come from?
It's a fairly recent phenomenon. If you look back at the history of Pakistan, the sort of critical mass of a sort of Muslim vision and practice has always been in the moderate middle. It's always been a sort of a mainstream Muslim society. It's always been very tolerant. It's always been very open-minded. Millions of Pakistanis go to Sufi shrines. They are incredibly popular, and people go there to, have a mystic personal relationship with God. I would say that during the Afghan jihad of the 80s, when the Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan, and the United States and Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and other groups came together to fight them, this allowed the introduction of whatever you want to call Wahhabism or Salafism, the more fundamentalist Sunni groups, which had lots of money in the Middle East, to begin to have much more influence on Afghanistan and Pakistan. So they built madrasas, which are these seminaries, all over Pakistan. They indoctrinated the students, and many of those students went to fight in Afghanistan against the Soviet Union. And so that was really the beginning of it. Now, there are several religious political parties in Pakistan that have existed longer than that, but they've been much more subtle about their goals. They've always played by the democratic rules. They've run candidates for office. They didn't espouse violence. They had their goals religiously were a more radical vision of Islam, but they never imposed on anyone. So it didn't start to become more of a volatile and more of a, as you said, passionately held idea of, let's do jihad and let's, create a pure society and let's go back to the early days of Islam and let's separate men from women, for example. That didn't really start to become a more powerful force in the culture and the society really until about, 20, 30 years ago.
And it was in the 1980s that one of the leaders, Zia-ul-Haq, went on a campaign to Islamize the nation. Why did he do that? What was he gaining from that?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because, his influence, he died a long time ago, but his influence has remained extremely strong throughout the country. And I even argue in the book that it's stronger than all the leaders that came after him, even today. There are those who argue, I never met him, but there are those who argue that he was in fact a very strict Muslim, that he believed that the society was becoming corrupt and vulgar and it needed to be straightened out and sort of put into order through all these rules that he promulgated and these laws, very, very draconian laws that he promulgated, especially having to do with women and sexual behavior and that kind of thing and drunkenness. He actually, adopted the practice of stoning and lashing people for things like drinking alcohol. But there are others who argued that it was all political, that he was using Islam to gain political power and political influence.
So after the assassination of Benazir Bhutto, there was it seemed like this campaign of terrorist attacks within Pakistan. These Islamist groups would attack markets, where women and children shopped, mosques, schools. And this is what shocked me the most, Pamela, about what was in your book, is that after all these horrific terrorist attacks, the victims would then blame America. They would blame India, Israel, for crying out loud. They just would not even accept the idea that these were Pakistani Muslim Islamists doing this to them.
Right. That was something that I heard everywhere I went. I probably went to the sites of at least 20 or maybe more terrorist attacks during the times that I was there. And I always tried to talk to as many people as possible, survivors, witnesses, neighbors. And over and over and over, people would say the same thing. It's just not possible that one of our compatriots from our own religion could have done this. So partly it was because they were shocked and they just simply couldn't believe it. But the other part of that is because there's been an enormous amount of indoctrination and propaganda coming out of these fundamentalist mosques and seminaries, as well as some political leaders. And, if you go and listen to them preaching on Fridays in different mosques in different cities. You hear this endless sort of venom spewing out about, America and the West are out to destroy Islam, to destroy us, to steal our nuclear weapons. They invaded Iraq, they invaded Afghanistan, they invaded Chechnya.
We're next.
They support Israel, they hate Palestine, we're next. Yes. And so people hear that all the time, and naturally they begin to believe it.
But these Pakistani Islamist groups don't even try to hide the fact that they're behind these. I mean, they'll put up signs in the marketplace and say, no selling CDs, no selling makeup, women should stay in the homes. And then that marketplace gets bombed.
Right, but they never acknowledge that they've done it. There's very little public discussion of that, actually, in Pakistan. You don't hear a lot of hue and cry. I mean, there are no demonstrations. You don't hear people going out and protesting, Partly it's fear. People are afraid of these groups. Very much so, but also it's much easier to blame foreigners. It's much easier to hold up a flag or a banner and say, down with America, than it is to say, down with the group around the corner.
Right. So it's either American Christians, Indian Hindus, or Israeli Jews that are behind this. It can't be a Muslim.
Right.
So this will never stop unless the people rise up and say, enough. You're not doing this to us, and you no longer have our support. It can't stop.
I would not quite put it that way. I would say that the people are not going to rise up. If the people do rise up, it's going to be in favor of Islamic Sharia, not against it. That's much more likely than the opposite. What is required, I think, is for the civilian leadership and the military leadership to both play a stronger role and rise to the occasion more aggressively in saying that this is wrong. It's not said enough, it's not said loudly enough, and it's not said enough by people who know that it's wrong.
And bring the perpetrators to justice.
As well.
The book we're discussing is called Playing with Fire, Pakistan at War with Itself. Pamela Constable is the author. She's a foreign correspondent and former deputy foreign editor at The Washington Post. What do Pakistanis believe happened on 9/11?
Well, they don't know much about it. Obviously, they weren't there. They've read, many accounts of it, many of which were biased. But what they think is really astonishing, because when I first heard this, I remember I first heard this in a public protest that was taking place just a couple of weeks later, and there were people screaming and yelling, and they were very upset, and they were not upset because people were killed in New York. They were upset because it was being blamed on Muslims, and they were saying that it was a plot. They were saying it was a plot by the CIA or
Mossad.
All this, Mossad. And I was sort of astonished at that, but I thought, well, these people are upset, so it's just an emotional thing that's circulating. But years went by, and I kept hearing this argument from people, educated people, people who were in the professions, people who had positions of influence, and I'm still not quite sure if they believed it, but people continue to say that it was simply not, again, possible that Muslims would have done this. It was done by their enemies to defame us and our religion.
What's the relationship between the Pakistani military and the people?
It's very positive. The Pakistanis have long viewed their army as the most respected, the most effective, the most efficient, and I think most importantly, really the only merit-based organization in the country. It's a place where everything is corrupt. To climb the ladder of success in business or in the bureaucracy, you have to grease many palms and go around things. But the army and the military in general has been seen as different and sees itself as different. A real place where if you excel, you'll be promoted. One main reason people have such respect for the military is because the civilians' institutions have done so poorly at governing. So by contrast, the military has always seen itself as, the savior of the country. We will come in and clean up the mess whenever the civilians screw up. So that's been the general thinking about it.
But let me ask you this, Pamela. How far has radical Islam infiltrated the Pakistani army?
The army sends out mixed signals on this issue of religiousness, as do many influential institutions in Pakistan. They They claim that they are, 100% professional, that you can't be a jihadist, that you're not allowed to grow a long, long beard, that you really are supposed to be just a soldier. But on the other hand, they also send out messages that are very religious in nature. If you look at the Army website, the Pakistani Army website, it's all about Islam. And they encourage recruits on the basis of defending Islam, not just defending Pakistan's borders. So they do send out mixed signals. And remember, Zia was a military dictator from the army, and he really planted this seed, and it has grown very, very deep roots.
Explain Pakistan's blasphemy law.
Pakistan's blasphemy law is very old, but it's only been in recent years that it's proven to be so controversial. Just to step back a minute for your listeners, blasphemy in the Pakistani context means blaspheming against Islam, and more especially against the Holy Prophet, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. If you insult him or the religion, even if it's unintentional, even if it's a joke, even if you just said it to your wife and somebody overheard you, you can be accused of blasphemy and sentenced to death. Now, because the law is so extreme, it is very, very easy to abuse. And so people constantly accuse each other of blasphemy, if they're having a dispute over land or a family feud, or in many cases it's used against religious minorities, particularly Christians and Ahmadi Muslims, who are a minority sect. And so they are often accused of blasphemy on the basis of, a casual conversation or an overheard remark. Somebody will rush off to the police station and say, I saw that man and he said something insulting to the Prophet Muhammad, arrest him. And they do. And very often these people will be taken to court. Sometimes they will be sentenced to death. Very, very, very rarely, almost never, are executions carried out. But people can spend their entire life in prison having been accused of simply saying something that was offensive to the feelings of Muslims. So it's a very, very strict law.
And any politician that tries to say, look, this isn't really compatible with a democracy, let's not do this, they get assassinated.
Well, there had been a debate growing within the political establishment in Parliament that it really needed to be modified, that the law really ought to be a bit more fair, a bit more modified. And so that debate was getting somewhere. It was beginning to be seriously discussed. But what happened in January was that, it happened previously, but there was a case, a blasphemy case of a peasant woman who was accused of blasphemy, a Christian woman, by her co-workers in her field. They had some disputes over other issues, and she was accused of blasphemy by her co-workers, taken to the police, taken to the court, sentenced to death, thrown into prison. Mother of I don't know how many children, but a mother. The governor of Punjab province, one of the most powerful positions in the country, was concerned about this. He went to visit her in prison, and he made a series of speeches, one in particular, in which he said he thought it was wrong. He thought it was an unfair law, and that it was unfair to have a woman, basically probably spend her life in prison when all she'd done was have an argument with some co-workers, basically. So, it sounded like a reasonable position, but as a result of that, the sensitivities of so many people to this issue of blasphemy are so strong that he was assassinated, and this governor, not only by a fellow Muslim and fellow Pakistani, but by his own highly trained, specially appointed bodyguard.
The book we're discussing is called Playing with Fire, Pakistan at War with Itself. Author and journalist Pamela Constable is my guest. Pamela, the United States has been giving a lot of money to Pakistan. A lot of it is military aid. What are we getting for all that money? And can't we get the level of animosity that we're getting for free?
Up until fairly recently, we were getting a lot. Again, going back to the Afghan war, basically the Pakistanis trained and launched the militia fighters with our weapons and our money that defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And if you really want to stretch the point, that essentially brought down the Soviet Union. So this is a very old relationship and a very strong relationship, especially on the military side. Now, of course, that was a long time ago. Since then, the relation has been, stable and relatively good. And then when Al-Qaeda came along and Osama came along, it kind of revived. The military intelligence relationship revived. And again, very strong positive relationship, and you could say we were getting plenty for our money. In the past several years, all that has changed. The situation has really deteriorated. There have been a number of incidents that have made it deteriorate. And as a result of that, we don't have time for all the details here, but as a result of that, there's now a very dramatic change in the American attitude in Congress and elsewhere about this aid. And aid is being suspended, put on hold, withdrawn. The brakes are being put on now on what was once a very free-flowing spigot of aid.
So, Pamela, look into your crystal ball for me. Tell me what's in store for Pakistan. Clearly a very volatile country, nuclear-armed country where anti-Americanism is extremely high. And, we didn't have time to talk about Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, who's a Pakistani-American. What do you see? What's coming up?
I often say that Pakistan is a country with enormous potential. It's a country that could be as successful and dynamic and getting ahead as fast as Turkey or Mexico or Indonesia or Bangladesh or India. And what holds it back, it's a lot of what my book is about, many different reasons. But I still say that all that potential is there. I mean, it's got a huge populace that's willing to work, that's desperate for better education and more job opportunities. So I'm still hopeful that that can happen. But it requires several things. It requires a new generation of leadership that instead of being obsessed with, India and being obsessed with spending huge amounts of money on defense, really refocuses its attentions on the social and economic needs of the populace. If that doesn't happen, the country really could fail. The other huge issue that Pakistan faces is demographic. The population is zooming out of control. The birth rate is still much too high. And so it's a country that's running out of water. It's an agricultural country that's running out of water. It's a country in which many, many people are flocking to the cities. The urban populations are skyrocketing, and the infrastructure simply doesn't exist to support these kinds of urban populations.
What should the United States do, if anything?
I would say that the United States should probably do what it's always said it's tried to do, which is to help Pakistan develop itself economically, help promote and strengthen civilian institutions and the integrity of civilian institutions, and try to help it develop in a way that will benefit Pakistan and its relationships with the modern world, rather than keeping it stuck in what's a sort of a feudal and militaristic bubble.
Pamela Constable, she's a foreign correspondent and former deputy foreign editor at The Washington Post. The book is Playing with Fire, Pakistan at War with Itself. It's published by Random House. Pamela, thanks so much for being on the program.
You're very welcome.
Email me your comments or questions to feedback@mgshow.org and join us on Facebook and Twitter. You can support this program through a variety of ways. Just visit mgshow.org and click on the link that says Support.